Talk to you later, butthead, Casey said, hanging up the phone. Resting her feet on the coffee table, she stared out the patio door. It was snowing yet again. This was her third winter in Wyoming, and while she thought she'd become accustomed to them, she hadn't. They were as brutal as everyone said, probably even worse. She couldn't decide what she hated more, the cold, the snow, or the wind. Probably the wind. That was year-round. Growing up, she'd always loved winter. It was her favorite season, but as she got older, she began detesting the cold weather and the snow. More and more, she daydreamed of moving to Arizona or Florida after graduation. Life in Laramie was temporary. Leaning back into the couch, she closed her eyes, but just as she started to doze off, the phone rang. Inching one eye open, she glared. It finally stopped in the middle of the 7th ring. It was probably her best friend Robin, calling to ask her to go to the Cowboy Lounge, and when Casey said no, it'd eventually turn into begging. That was their usual Friday night drinking location, and there was a guy Robin wanted to introduce Casey to, but she didn't feel like being social. All she really wanted was a Frosty and fries, but she was too tired to throw on a coat and drive the 5 blocks to Wendy's. So her night was going to consist of a long hot shower, a frozen pepperoni pizza, and watching Beetlejuice on her worn-out VHS tape for probably the 50th time. A little after 8, Casey placed the pizza in the oven, set the timer, then went into the bathroom and turned on the water and slipped off her clothes. Within a minute, steam filled the room and the mirror was covered with a layer of condensation. Casey preferred her showers with nearly scalding water. The hotter, the better. As she was washing her hair, a loud bang startled her. It sounded like it was coming from the patio. Then another one, this time louder. Something, or someone, had crashed into her sliding glass door. Pulling open the curtain, Casey stuck her head out. "Hello? Is somebody there?" Her voice barely rose above the sound of the water. Through the half-open door, Casey watched the hallway and a portion of the living room. The noise gave her an uneasy feeling. She turned off the water. Then, with suds still in her hair, she grabbed a towel and stepped out of the bathtub. "If someone is out there, I have a gun and I know how to use it," she said, volume rising as she spoke. That was a lie. She'd never even held a gun, let alone fired one. The closest form of protection in her apartment was her mismatched cutlery, but that was in the kitchen. If someone was in her apartment, her best line of defense would be screaming at the top of her lungs. For about a minute, she stared into the living room. Nothing. She waited for about another 20 seconds, then scurried to the front door and checked the doorknob and deadbolt. They were both locked. Then she checked the patio door, also locked. Standing in the middle of the living room, Casey stared at the kitchen wall, concluding that the noises had probably actually come from her neighbor Kyle, a gas station attendant who smoked enough marijuana for 3 people. As she walked back to the bathroom, she turned on the lights in the kitchen and hallway. After finishing her shower, she ate half the pizza, accompanied by a beer, and then inserted the tape into the VCR. She crawled onto the couch, and within 10 minutes she was drifting to sleep. Later in the night, she awoke to static on the TV screen. Barely awake, she turned it off and made her way into the bedroom, then crawled under the comforter and closed her eyes. Something woke her, and instantly she sensed that someone was in her room, next to her bed. Casey prayed that it was a dream, a nightmare. Slowly, she opened her eyes and saw the silhouette of a man hovering over her. He was donned in all black. Black pants, black hoodie, black gloves, and a black ski mask. Through the opening of the ski mask, she could see the whites of his eyes. Just as she was about to scream, he pressed the edge of a cold knife against her throat. "If you scream, I'll slice your fucking throat from ear to ear," he whispered. Casey didn't recognize the voice, but he sounded older, definitely not a college student. Fear rushed through her body. This could not be happening to her, not her. Paralyzed, she faintly muttered, "Who are you?" The man stood still for a long moment, then shook his head. "What do you want?" she said, her voice quivering. Again, he shook his head in a steady motion. remaining silent. Without him taking his eyes off Casey, the blade started inching down her neck, stopping at the crest of her sternum. Casey glanced down at the knife, then back up at the man. As much as she wanted to cry, she didn't want to appear weak. And as much as she wanted to fight, she knew her only option at the moment was to comply with his demands, no matter how vile they might be. She'd wait for an opening to grab the knife or run out the front door. And if he forced oral on her, she'd bite down as hard as she could. Searching for something to say, she blurted, "I have herpes. I do. I don't have a breakout right now, but if you fuck me, you'll get herpes, I promise." That was another lie. She remembered reading a news story about a girl who'd said the same thing during an attack, and the man had released the girl without harming her. She prayed that this man would believe her and leave the apartment. "Yeah, like you have a gun." His voice was ice cold. Shivers ran through her entire body. It had been hours since she yelled that. He must have been watching her the entire night. She tried to think of a response, but her mind was blank. "This'll all be over soon," he said. Out of the corner of her eye, Casey saw a fist coming down on her. There was no time to react, so she turned her head and closed her eyes. In a fraction of a second, everything went black. When she regained consciousness, her vision was blurry and her head was throbbing. The mattress was wet under her. Either blood or urine. Maybe both. Her sense of time had vanished. She had no idea how long she'd been knocked out or if the man was still in her apartment. Glancing down, she saw that her pajama top had been ripped open and her breasts were exposed. The bedsheet covered her below the waist, but she assumed her bottoms had been torn off as well. Her lips were bound with duct tape, same with her wrists and ankles. She knew she'd been raped, but she didn't want to think about it. All she wanted was for the man to be gone. The room was empty, no sign of him. Closing her eyes, she leaned toward the hallway and listened. The apartment was still. Silent. 10 seconds. Nothing. 20 seconds. 30. Nothing. After what felt like minutes of complete silence, she was certain the man was no longer in her apartment. She attempted to scream, but her voice was muted. Another attempt, this time with every remaining ounce of strength to open her mouth, but her jaw barely moved, and the scream was only audible to her. For a fleeting second, she thought she was going to vomit, but she managed to fight the urge. With her taped mouth, it could lead to death by aspiration. Unable to scream, Casey knew no one could help her. She was alone. Completely alone. Turning away, she stared at the courtyard light shining through the blinds and started cursing herself. If she'd only met Robin at the bar, the man would have found no one home and probably searched for another victim. She might have gotten drunk and stayed at Robin's apartment, or maybe she would have run into Jack, her ex-boyfriend, at one of the campus bars and gone home with him. Or maybe she would have gone home with another guy. Countless, seemingly inconsequential events that could have changed the outcome of her life. Forever. Then her thoughts shifted to Hannah. Thankfully, the blizzard had happened when it did, because if it had been a few days earlier or later, Hannah would have come up for the weekend like they'd planned. She would have been sleeping on the couch when the man entered the apartment, and she'd most likely be a victim by now. At least Casey didn't have to live her final moments knowing that. Better her than Hannah. Just as she was about to attempt to roll out of bed, the toilet flushed and the faucet turned on. Casey forced her eyes closed, not wanting him to see that she'd regained consciousness. Never a religious person, she nonetheless started to pray, a final hope to be saved. She prayed that a neighbor had seen the man break into her apartment and had called the police. She prayed a friend would show up unannounced, scaring the man away. She prayed the man would leave the apartment and never return. But she was certain none of her prayers would be answered. The man crept into the room and stopped at the edge of the bed. There was a faint smell of cheap cologne, something a middle-aged divorcee would wear. As he hovered over her, he started humming a song. And at first, Casey attempted to ignore it, but he grew louder and louder, and it became impossible. It took a moment to place the song, but finally she recognized it as Cherry, Cherry by Neil Diamond. Then, starting at her belly button, he slowly ran his finger up her stomach, over her breasts and up her chin, where he began circling her lips. "Look at me," he said, tapping lightly on her cheek. "I know you can hear me." Casey didn't want to look into the eyes of the man who was going to kill her. After a second of silence, he leaned into her face, holding the knife under her chin once more. "I said, look at me." Casey turned, and their eyes met. Almost instantly, she looked away. "What is this?" he said, lifting Casey's silver flower pendant necklace off her chest. "No, no," she muttered through the tape, her eyes becoming wet. "I'm sorry, but you have no choice in the matter." Gripped by a paralyzing fear, she said, "Please don't kill me." The man smiled, then ripped the necklace off and slipped it into his pocket. Then, without saying a word, he plunged the knife into her upper abdomen. She cried out and attempted to squirm, but with his other hand, the man positioned his rough fingers around her neck, beginning to squeeze the life out of her. As she lay motionless on the bed, bleeding out, he stabbed her 2 more times. Then, with the knife still in her flesh, he twisted the blade to the left, then to the right, and back to the left. Blood began cascading down the sides of her stomach, drowning the mattress. The pain was overwhelming, and in a final attempt for help, Casey screamed, but the cry was only heard by her and the man. Just as she was about to black out, as if he knew the exact moment, the man released his grasp around her neck and removed the knife, then took a few steps back. He lit a cigarette and admired his work like a painter admiring their masterpiece. When he was finished, he dropped the cigarette onto the carpet, stomped it out with his boot, then picked up the butt and slipped it into his pocket. Then he backed out of the bedroom and disappeared into the hallway. Moments later, Casey heard the patio door open, then close. The man was gone, and she was alone. With her remaining strength, she began rocking back and forth in an attempt to sit up, but she couldn't. She was too weak. It felt like every heartbeat was becoming fainter and further apart. The tape over her mouth made her feel like she was suffocating, a ship at the bottom of the sea running out of air. Any chance of survival was rapidly fading, and there was no question in her mind she was dying. Without a miracle, she'd be dead within hours. Her life over, before it even started. Not even 21. Minutes passed like seconds, and hours passed like minutes. Sometime that morning, the sun shone down through the blinds, and she could hear voices in the courtyard, and cars leaving the parking lot. People were going on about their day, going to work, going to school, going to get coffee. Suddenly, everything she'd never experience again started running through her head. She'd never see another sunset. She'd never go on another hike. She'd never hear the laughter of another person. Never have another kiss. She would never put her feet in the ocean. And she'd never hear Hannah's voice again. In those final moments, all Casey could think about was Hannah. She wanted to tell her that she loved her and that she was an amazing sister and friend, and that she was going to miss her. All she wanted was to see Hannah one last time, to hug and hold her. Turning to the blinds, she stared at the sunlight for a moment. Then, with no more strength to keep her eyes open, they slowly started to close.